Hello everyone and welcome back to Haunted Tales. Tonight, we delve into the 10 most disturbing true encounters from the Appalachian deep woods, places where mist-shrouded ridges and forgotten hollows guard secrets that refuse to stay buried. In this episode, we will journey into the darkest corners of these ancient mountains, where 10 individuals faced inexplicable horrors that left them shaken to their very core. Each story you are about to hear has been painstakingly researched and adapted from first-hand accounts, eyewitness testimonies, and local legends, experiences that are far from ordinary. These are not the kind of tales you'll hear around a campfire. These are documented encounters that left indelible marks on those who survived them. To protect the identities of the brave souls who shared their stories, certain names and locations have been altered, but the terror they endured remains real. So, if you're ready to confront the unknown, make sure to subscribe to Haunted Tales and hit the notification bell. Because once you enter the Appalachians with us tonight, the fog, the shadows, and the whispers of the deep woods may follow you long after the screen goes dark. Boone County, West Virginia, lies deep in the folds of the Appalachian Mountains, a place where fog lingers between ridges, like a ghost that never learned to leave. Locals speak of the woods in hushed tones, not because they fear animals or terrain, but because there are places where the silence feels wrong. Hollow Creek is one of them. It begins as a thin ribbon of water cutting through a narrow ravine, and then widens into a maze of moss-covered trails that vanish beneath towering trees. On most maps, it doesn't even exist anymore, the name erased after a flood washed out part of the access road in the late 1980s. But in the small town of Whitesville, people still know it. They say if you follow the creek too far, it'll start whispering to you. In the spring of 1997, 3 friends decided to test those whispers. Eli Turner was 21, a quiet, lanky boy who worked part-time at a gas station. His best friend, Brent Lawson, was louder, the kind who laughed easily and feared nothing. Casey Moore was the middle ground between them, practical and steady. They had grown up together in the same dusty neighborhood, and when Eli bought himself a second-hand video camera, the 3 decided to document a weekend hike through Hollow Creek Trail. It was meant to be a simple adventure: a few beers, a campfire, and a chance to get footage for a small-town contest promoting local tourism. They left on a Thursday morning, parking their truck near an abandoned ranger post that had long since been swallowed by weeds. The air smelled of wet bark and wildflowers. A handwritten note left on the dashboard read, "Gone hiking. Be back Sunday." Witnesses later said they were in good spirits, laughing, tossing gear into their packs. Not a trace of hesitation in their steps as they disappeared into the tree line. For 6 days, no one heard from them. Then, on the 7th, a storm rolled through Boone County. The sky cracked open, dumping sheets of rain that turned trails into rivers and creeks into raging torrents. Around midnight, a man driving along County Route 17 spotted a figure stumbling out of the woods. It was Eli. He was naked, covered in mud from head to toe, his skin cut and bruised, his lips trembling as he muttered a single phrase over and over. "He's still under there. He's under the roots." When rescuers found him, Eli's eyes were bloodshot and unfocused. His nails were torn down to raw skin as though he had been digging barehanded. The paramedics said his body temperature was dangerously low, yet he fought to break free of the blanket they wrapped around him, insisting that they had to cover the ground before it opened again. He was rushed to Charleston Area Medical Center, where doctors treated his wounds and sedated him. He slept for almost 2 days. When he woke, he refused to speak. He sat by the window of his hospital room, staring at the rain, whispering something under his breath, a steady rhythm of words no one could understand. Search and rescue teams combed the Hollow Creek Trail for 5 days straight. They found nothing but shredded camping gear half buried in the mud and a broken camcorder, its tape missing. The tent stakes had been ripped from the ground and the soil beneath was disturbed, as though something had burrowed up from below. A ranger described the area as unnaturally soft, like it had been hollowed from within. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no footprints leading away, only 3 impressions in the dirt where sleeping bags had once been laid. The sheriff called off the search after the 5th day, citing exhaustion and dangerous conditions from the storm. In the following weeks, rumors spread through Whitesville. Some said the boys had fallen into an old mine shaft, others that they'd been attacked by a bear. But none of those theories explained what happened next. A month after the incident, 3 high school students, curious after hearing the stories, decided to explore Hollow Creek themselves. They brought flashlights, a cheap camera, and more bravery than sense. According to their testimony, they followed the trail until they reached a clearing where the creek widened and disappeared beneath the roots of a massive oak tree. The water was dark, almost black, reflecting nothing. One of them swore he saw movement beneath the surface, something pale, almost human-shaped. When the footage from that night was turned over to police, most of it was grainy static. But near the end, there was a short clip that made investigators uneasy. The camera panned across the creek. The water rippled, and for just a moment, something white flickered beneath the current. A face, hollow-eyed and twisted, the mouth open as though screaming. Then the image jerked violently, and the recording cut to black. The teens were questioned but released. They never spoke about what they saw again. One of them, years later, confessed privately that he hadn't told the whole truth. He claimed that as they fled the woods, they heard someone whisper his name, not from behind them, but from beneath the ground. Meanwhile, Eli Turner remained in psychiatric care. When he finally began to talk, his story came out in fragments, half memories tangled with terror. He said that their first night on the trail had been uneventful, just the sounds of crickets and the distant rush of the creek. But by the second night, something changed. He described a deep vibration in the ground, as if something was moving below them, shifting the earth like an animal tunneling. They heard scratching, slow, deliberate, coming from beneath their tent. Brent thought it was a raccoon and poked the dirt with a stick. The stick sank almost a foot before hitting something solid that made a dull, wet sound. Then the ground went still. Eli said they laughed about it for a while, trying to ignore the smell that had begun to rise, a sweet metallic rot that clung to their clothes. But after midnight, the laughter died. The forest had gone silent. Even the water seemed to stop moving. That's when Casey woke them. He said he'd heard someone outside the tent walking in circles. Eli unzipped the flap and pointed his flashlight toward the trees. There was no one there, only the oak with its tangled roots half submerged in the mud. Yet, as the light passed over the trunk, something shifted. The bark seemed to breathe, expanding slightly, and then the roots twitched, curling inward. The next few moments were chaos. The ground collapsed beneath Brent's sleeping bag, and he screamed as his legs disappeared into the dirt. Casey grabbed his arm, trying to pull him free, but the soil moved like quicksand. Eli remembered the sound, not a human cry, but something deep and guttural coming from below, like air escaping from a cavern. The flashlight fell, the beam spinning wildly, catching glimpses of what was underneath. A figure emerging from the hole, its skin rough like bark, its limbs stretching unnaturally long. Its face was a mask of soil and root fibers, yet where the eyes should have been, there were only 2 hollow sockets filled with moving insects. Eli ran. He didn't remember how far, only that he tripped several times, cutting his hands on rocks, his breath ragged. Behind him, he could still hear Brent screaming, a sound that grew faint and then vanished, swallowed by the forest. The last thing Eli recalled was reaching the creek and falling into it. The water was freezing, the current strong, pulling him downstream until everything went dark. When he opened his eyes again, it was daylight. He was lying near the road, naked, shivering, his mind blank except for a single image, the oak tree and the hollow beneath it. Still breathing. In the years that followed, Hollow Creek became one of those places locals spoke of only when they'd had too much to drink. Hikers who strayed too close to the area reported strange occurrences, whispers that seemed to come from underground, faint scratching sounds under their boots, and the occasional glimpse of movement just beyond the edge of vision. A ranger who returned to the site in 2005 claimed the tree was still there, though its trunk had grown twisted and hollowed, as if something large had been living inside it. He refused to go near it again. By 2010, the trail was officially closed. The sign that once marked the entrance now lies half buried in moss, letters faded by rain. But every so often, after heavy storms, locals find footprints along the creek bed, barefoot, deep and leading nowhere. The earth still shifts in that spot, soft and damp even in summer, as though something beneath it still breathes. They say if you stand there long enough, you can hear it, a faint voice under the soil calling for help. But no one ever answers because everyone in Boone County knows the truth. Once the ground opens, it doesn't give back what it takes. A group of local teens, curious about the disappearance, hiked down Hollow Creek with flashlights and a cheap camcorder. They reached a small clearing where the creek bent around a tangle of massive oak roots. And there, one of them swore he saw something pale, like a face, just beneath the water's surface. The footage they recorded that night was turned over to authorities. Most of it There's a stretch of Highway 19 that runs through the hills outside Summersville, a desolate ribbon of asphalt flanked by trees so tall they seem to swallow the moon. Truckers call it the Black Mile, not because it's dangerous or cursed, but because no matter how bright your headlights are, the darkness there feels thicker. It eats the light. Locals say you can drive it 100 times without issue, but if you ever find yourself there alone after midnight, you should keep your eyes straight ahead and never, ever look into your mirrors. The first official report came in November 2004, though stories had been whispered long before. A long-haul driver named Marcus Hale was hauling timber south toward Beckley when he called dispatch at 2:47 a.m., his voice shaky, slurred. He said something was running beside the rig. Dispatch asked if he meant a deer. Marcus went quiet for a moment, then whispered, "It's not an animal. It's keeping up." The transmission ended abruptly, replaced by a burst of static. 30 minutes later, another driver found his truck idling on the shoulder, headlights still on. Marcus was gone. The cab door hung open, the radio still crackling faintly with white noise. His wallet and keys were still on the seat. For days, the police searched the area. Dogs picked up a scent trail that ran parallel to the highway for nearly a mile before vanishing into the woods. What they found deeper inside was stranger. Huge impressions in the soft ground, spaced far apart, too far for a human stride, but shaped like footprints. The soil around them was slightly burned as though something hot had touched it. No body was ever found. Truckers began avoiding the route after dark. Those who had no choice spoke of odd things happening near mile marker 212, the hum of their engines faltering, their CB radios filling with whispers, or the faint outline of something pacing them in the reflection of their side mirrors. One driver said he saw the shadow of a man sprinting alongside his trailer for several seconds, perfectly in sync with the truck's speed, before it suddenly veered off and disappeared into the trees. When he checked the side of his rig later, he found long, smudged handprints trailing from the front bumper to the back wheels. In early 2006, a dashcam video surfaced briefly online before being pulled down. It was grainy and shaky, recorded by a driver named Eric Landers. He had been driving north toward Summersville when his camera picked up movement on the shoulder, a figure standing motionless facing the road. As the truck approached, the figure began running. It matched his speed, 70 miles an hour, its outline flickering like heat shimmer. Then, in a single frame, it seemed to lean forward, almost pressing its face against the glass of the driver's window before vanishing. The video ended there. Investigators who reviewed it said there were distortions in the footage that couldn't be explained by motion blur or lighting. The pixels bent unnaturally, like the camera had been trying to focus on something that wasn't really there. Locals began calling the entity the Shadow Walker. Rumors spread that it was the ghost of a man killed decades earlier during the construction of Highway 19, a worker crushed beneath a collapsed retaining wall whose body was never recovered. Others believed it was something older, something drawn to movement, to engines, to the pulse of life that crossed through its territory. Whatever it was, the stories kept coming. In 2011, a couple returning from a family gathering in Summersville claimed their car was followed by a dark shape that moved in the periphery of their headlights. The husband, thinking it was an animal, slowed down, but the shape didn't slow. It grew taller, its limbs elongating as it ran parallel to the car. The wife described it as a shadow with a spine, completely black but reflecting just enough light to define its outline. It darted forward suddenly, crossing the road in front of them, and for a split second, both swore they saw two eyes, not glowing, but shimmering faintly, like oil on water. When they reached the next town, the front of their car was streaked with dark, hand-shaped prints that smelled faintly of smoke. Police reports from that region began to follow a pattern. Strange figures on the road, unexplainable interference in radio transmissions, and a sharp temperature drop in the cab moments before sightings occurred. One trucker described it perfectly. "It's like the air forgets how to breathe." Another said he could feel the weight of someone climbing onto the side of his trailer while driving, though the mirrors showed nothing but darkness. When he finally pulled over and stepped out, he heard footsteps on the gravel, slow and deliberate, circling him. But when his flashlight swept across the asphalt, there was nothing there, just the faint smell of ozone and a warmth in the air, like the ghost of friction. In 2017, construction began on a bypass meant to reroute traffic away from that particular section of Highway 19. The crews didn't last long. Workers complained of feeling watched, their equipment malfunctioning, or tools disappearing overnight. One man quit on his first day after seeing something standing in the tree line across the road, tall, human-shaped, but too thin, like a shadow stretched to breaking. It didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there as if studying him. He left his gear behind and never came back. That winter, one of the project supervisors, a man named Terry Hodge, filed a private report after an encounter he never spoke of publicly. He wrote that while driving home late at night, he saw what looked like a man crawling in the middle of the highway. Terry slowed, thinking it was someone injured, but as his headlights illuminated the figure, it rose to its feet in one fluid motion. Its limbs unfolded unnaturally long, and its skin, or whatever covered it, seemed to shimmer like heat waves. Terry floored the gas, swerving past it. In his rearview mirror, the figure was running again, keeping pace for several seconds before dissolving into the dark. When he arrived home, he found streaks along the side of his truck that glowed faintly under UV light, forming handprints that trailed off into smears. The bypass was eventually completed, but the old stretch of Highway 19 remains. Locals still use it sometimes, mostly those who've lived there long enough to ignore the stories. But even they admit there's something off about that road. At night, the fog there seems thicker, heavier, almost alive. The sound of your own tires feels muffled, and sometimes when you look to the side, the trees appear to bend ever so slightly toward you, as if something unseen is moving between them. One final report closed the file in 2020, though it was never made public. A driver hauling an empty flatbed claimed that his truck began shaking violently just past mile marker 212. He thought he had blown a tire, but when he checked, everything was intact. The shaking grew worse, and then his trailer jerked downward, as though something heavy had landed on it. The truck slowed under the strain, though the weight sensors showed nothing. He pressed harder on the gas, terrified. Moments later, a loud thud echoed on the roof of the cab, followed by what he described as footsteps, slow and deliberate. He didn't stop until he reached a well-lit rest area 20 miles away. When he stepped out, the roof of his cab was dented inward in two spots, shaped like footprints. Today, Highway 19 still runs quiet through the mountains of Summersville. Most nights it's empty except for the distant hum of 18-wheelers passing through the fog. But every so often, drivers report something strange, the faint outline of a figure pacing them in the darkness, matching their speed step for step, only to vanish when the high beams catch it. And if you ever find yourself there after midnight, you might notice your headlights dim just slightly, or your radio whisper with static for no reason. That's when most locals say you should look forward, keep your hands tight on the wheel, and whatever you do, don't glance at your mirrors. Because if the stories are true, the moment you do, you'll see it. A figure running beside your car, face inches from the glass, smiling through the dark. Marcus Hale's disappearance became the kind of story that spreads in whispers across diner counters and CB radio chatter. Before that night, he was known as a steady, no-nonsense trucker, a man who'd driven the same stretch of Highway 19 for 15 years without a single ticket or breakdown. But on the night of November 12, 2004, something changed. The weather was clear and cold, the kind of night where sound carries for miles. He'd radioed dispatch around 2:47 a.m., his voice trembling as he said something was running beside the rig. When they asked if he meant an animal, he went silent for 7 full seconds before replying, "It's not an animal. It's got arms." That was the last thing anyone heard from him. When a fellow trucker found his semi idling on the shoulder 30 minutes later, the cab light was still on, the engine The Elkmont Tunnel doesn't appear on most modern maps anymore. Hidden off an old logging road in the Great Smoky Mountains, it's a forgotten artery from the 1930s, a single-lane passage carved through stone, slick with condensation and heavy with the smell of earth that never dries. Locals call it the Screaming Tunnel, though no one agrees on when the name began. Some claim it was after a landslide in 1942 that buried 3 workers alive inside. Others say it dates further back, to the early Appalachian settlers, when a family of 5 disappeared on that stretch and were never found. The only constant is the sound, a scream that comes from deep inside the tunnel after midnight. Those who've heard it say it's not human, not entirely. It begins low, like the rumble of the mountain itself, before rising into a shriek so sharp it feels like it pierces the bones. For decades, the tunnel sat abandoned. Moss crept down its mouth, and water dripped steadily from its ceiling, echoing like footsteps that never reached their end. But in 1989, a group of 4 friends from Maryville, 2 couples in their early 20s, decided to explore it after hearing about it in a bar. Their names were David and Laura Fields, and Michael and Carrie Nolan. They brought flashlights, a Polaroid, and cheap beer, treating the legend like a game. Around 11:45 p.m., they parked near the overgrown turnoff and followed the trail down through the trees. The deeper they went, the quieter the forest became, until the sound of their own breathing was the only thing left. The entrance yawned before them like a wound in the hillside, the air colder by 10 degrees. Laura joked that it smelled like wet metal and graves. She wasn't wrong. The others laughed, but even their laughter seemed to vanish too quickly, absorbed by the tunnel's stone throat. The first 50 feet were harmless, just rough brick and trickling water. Then David noticed something odd. His flashlight beam bent strangely at the center, as if the air were thicker there. He called for the others to stop. When Michael turned to look back, the tunnel's entrance seemed farther away than it should have been. He blinked, shook his head, told himself it was just darkness playing tricks. But the distance felt wrong, stretched, elastic, like they'd walked deeper than they physically could have. Carrie began to hum nervously, her voice trembling. That's when they heard the first sound, a soft scraping, metal against stone. It came from ahead, rhythmic, like someone dragging a shovel slowly along the wall. They froze. Laura whispered, "Hello?" Her voice came back to her, not as an echo, but as a whisper that didn't belong to her mouth. Slightly delayed, slightly distorted. David raised his flashlight, and for a second, the beam caught something wet and pale moving against the wall. But when he focused, it was gone. They decided to turn back. The problem was the tunnel behind them didn't look the same. The wall seemed to pulse with moisture darker than before, and the floor was slick with a thin layer of something that smelled faintly of sulfur and iron. Every few steps, their lights flickered, all 4 simultaneously, as if the darkness was breathing with them. When they finally saw daylight again, they ran for it. The cold night air hit them like salvation. But before they could reach the car, Laura screamed. Her Polaroid camera had clicked on by itself, snapping a picture of the tunnel entrance. They didn't think much of it, not until they got home and developed the photo. The image showed all 4 of them standing outside, exactly as they had been, except there was a 5th figure behind them, tall, skeletal, with a face that seemed to stretch open mid-scream. Its hands reached toward Laura's shoulder, fingers blurred like motion caught between frames. Within weeks, strange things began happening to them. David started hearing dripping water in his apartment, even though his ceiling was dry. Michael reported waking at night to the sound of footsteps circling his bed, always stopping just at his feet. Carrie found long, damp handprints on her bathroom mirror each morning. Laura, the one in the photo, grew pale and sleepless. She told friends she could still hear the scream when she closed her eyes. 2 months later, she vanished. Her car was found parked near the Elkmont turnoff, keys still in the ignition, camera on the passenger seat. The last picture in it showed the inside of the tunnel, and in the center, a faint light shaped like a woman's face mid-scream, glowing faintly in the dark. In 1991, rangers sealed the tunnel's entrance with heavy steel bars, citing unstable conditions. But hikers still report hearing the scream through the mountain at night, long after midnight, echoing faintly through the trees. Some say it's the trapped spirit of one of the buried workers. Others believe it's something older, something the mountain itself keeps locked beneath its skin. Locals avoid that section of the trail entirely. The few who've tried to pry the bars open swear that the metal feels warm to the touch, almost like flesh. And sometimes, when fog rolls down from the ridge and the forest falls silent, you can still hear it. A woman's voice, distant and distorted, rising from beneath the ground. A scream that starts as a whisper and builds until it feels like the entire mountain is crying out through stone. After the tunnel was sealed in 1991, Elkmont returned to its usual rhythm, a sleepy corner of Tennessee where locals spoke softly and the mountains seemed to breathe at night. For a while, the legend quieted too. But silence never lasts long in places that remember tragedy. In 1995, two park rangers, Thomas Grady and his trainee, Sarah Vickers, were assigned to check the sealed entrance after reports of vandalism. They arrived just after dusk, headlights sweeping across the misty tree line. The forest was strangely still that evening. Even the cicadas had gone silent. The tunnel sat like a wound in the hillside, its metal gate streaked with rust and something darker. When Thomas knelt to inspect the padlock, his flashlight flickered once, then steadied. "Looks fine," he muttered, but Sarah was staring into the darkness beyond the bars. She swore she saw something moving inside, not distinctly, just the subtle shifting of deeper shadow against stone. Then came a faint sound, soft but deliberate. 3 knocks against the tunnel wall, hollow, echoing. Thomas called out, "Anyone in there?" The only reply was a long exhale of cold air that rolled from the tunnel's mouth, carrying the faint scent of wet iron. They left quickly, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, in her cabin, she heard dripping water, though every tap was closed tight. Around 3 a.m., she woke to find her window fogged from the outside, as if someone had breathed against it. When she wiped the glass, she found 5 long streaks running down the pane, too wide for human fingers, and faintly glowing where the moonlight touched. She reported it to her supervisor the next morning, trembling, but he brushed it off as condensation. 2 days later, Thomas Grady disappeared. His patrol vehicle was found parked on the same access road near the tunnel. The driver's door was open. His flashlight lay in the mud, still on, its beam pointing toward the bars. The padlock was unlatched. The gate was ajar. They found no footprints leading away, only a single trail of water seeping from the tunnel into the gravel, as though the mountain itself had cried him in. By 1996, the Park Service officially declared the site unsafe and restricted access entirely. But people kept coming. Paranormal groups, urban explorers, college kids chasing ghost stories. They all wanted to hear the scream for themselves. One of the most infamous videos surfaced online in 2008, uploaded by a group from Knoxville. The footage starts with laughter, flashlights jittering, a shaky camera panning over the rusted gate. One of them, a woman's voice, says, "Okay, let's count to 10 and listen." For 9 seconds, there's only the ambient hum of forest insects. Then faintly something shifts. A low groan, deep and uneven, crawling through the tunnel like an animal waking from sleep. The woman gasps. The sound grows louder. Not a groan now, but a voice rising in pitch, distorting into a scream so violent the microphone crackles. The video ends with the camera dropping, lights spinning, and the image cutting to black. Investigators later noted something disturbing. When slowed down, the scream wasn't one voice, but several layered together, male and female overlapping, as though the tunnel itself was filled with countless trapped throats crying out in unison. The account was deleted 2 days after upload, the user profile wiped clean. But copies circulate quietly to this day, shared on obscure forums under titles like The Elkmont Resonance or Voices of the Hollow. Locals began noticing changes in the land itself. Hunters reported hearing muffled cries when fog settled low across the valley. Hikers spoke of finding puddles of standing water that reflected faces not their own. One woman, a resident of nearby Townsend, claimed she saw a pale figure standing at the tunnel entrance in broad daylight. A woman in an old-fashioned dress, her mouth open as if mid-scream, though no sound came out. She blinked and the figure was gone, leaving only the echo of rushing air, like a long sigh through the trees. Rangers dismissed the stories publicly, but off-record, they avoided the area. One even admitted under anonymity that radio signals near the tunnel would distort, voices breaking into static, then reassembling into words they hadn't spoken. Then came the landslide of 2012. A heavy storm rolled through the Smokies, causing part of the hillside above the tunnel to collapse. Emergency crews arrived at dawn, expecting to find mud and rock. There's a hollow in southeastern Kentucky that most locals don't talk about after sunset. It lies deep beyond a fading stretch of gravel off Route 119, a valley so narrow the sun barely touches it even at noon. They call it Harlan Hollow, though old maps once marked it differently. Carter's Fold, Miner's Cut, and before that, just a shaded indentation with no name. The hills around it are steep, cluttered with skeletal trees that twist toward the sky like black veins. What makes the place strange isn't the quiet, it's the absence of sound. Birds don't roost there. Even the wind avoids it, curling around the ridge instead of through it. For decades, stories have passed through that part of Appalachia about a boy who vanished there. A boy whose voice, some say, still calls for help in the dark. The story begins in 1957, when the Calhoun family lived at the base of the hollow, a modest two-room shack with a tin roof and a front porch that overlooked the creek. They were poor, like most mining families in Harlan County, but content. Their youngest child, Eli Calhoun, was 6 years old, a curious boy with hay-colored hair and a habit of wandering too far into the woods. On the morning of October 3rd, Eli's mother sent him out to fetch firewood before supper. The boy walked into the trees and never came back. When his father found the bundle of sticks neatly tied near the path but no trace of his son, the search began. Neighbors, miners, and deputies combed the hollow for 3 days, calling his name until their throats went raw. Bloodhounds picked up the scent near the creek but lost it abruptly where the earth dipped into a shallow sinkhole, one that hadn't been there the day before. They found no body, no torn clothing, no sign of struggle, only the boy's small footprints circling the rim of the sinkhole, as though he'd been pacing, unsure whether to step closer. By the 5th day, the search was called off. Locals whispered that the mountain had taken him, swallowed him whole, as one old miner put it. In these parts, people believe the earth keeps its own secrets. That night, a storm rolled through the hollow, lightning striking so close the ground steamed. The next morning, the sinkhole had filled with murky water. The Calhouns left soon after, unable to bear the sight of it. The shack rotted in silence, its windows broken by years of wind and weather. But then the voices began. The first was in 1963. A man named Roy Denton, who'd bought land near the hollow to build a hunting cabin, told authorities he'd heard a child crying late one evening. He followed the sound down to the creek with a lantern. The woods were wet and cold, the smell of moss thick in the air. The crying grew louder, echoing between the trees. But when he reached the clearing, there was no one there, only ripples in the creek and something small resting on the bank. It was a child's shoe, half buried in the mud, old and cracked with time. When Roy picked it up, the crying stopped instantly. He dropped it and ran. Later, when he returned in daylight, the shoe was gone, but there were footprints, small, barefoot, leading straight from the water toward his unfinished cabin. They ended at the doorway. From then on, no one stayed long in Harlan Hollow. Hunters complained of voices whispering their names from the trees. Others heard humming, a soft tune that drifted through the fog before dawn. One night in 1972, a coal inspector driving the back road near the hollow saw a boy standing in the middle of the lane. He was barefoot, dressed in old-fashioned overalls, and dripping wet as if he'd just come from the creek. The inspector swerved, slammed on the brakes, and jumped out. But the boy was gone. Only the wet footprints remained, glistening on the asphalt. He later described the sound that followed as he got back in his truck, a faint tapping against the rear window, like small fingers knocking to be let in. When he turned, there was nothing there, just fog curling around the taillights. For a while, it seemed like the legend would fade, just another story told by miners over beer and smoke. But in 1999, 2 teenagers disappeared in the same hollow. Their car was found abandoned near the creek, headlights still on, radio humming with low static. The search lasted a week. Eventually, authorities discovered their footprints leading into the woods, then stopping abruptly beside the same sinkhole that had taken Eli Calhoun 40 years earlier. The ground had shifted again, opening wider. Rescuers peered inside and found nothing but black water that seemed to move against the wind. That night, one of the deputies swore he heard a boy's voice echo from below, calling, "Mama." His report was quietly filed and never spoken of again. In 2017, a research team from the University of Kentucky visited the site to document local folklore. They brought sonar equipment to scan beneath the hollow's floor. What they found startled even the most skeptical among them. Beneath the soil was a vast network of caverns, some natural, some clearly man-made, dating back to the early mining operations of the 1910s. But one chamber stood out. It was dome-shaped, deep beneath the sinkhole, and partially collapsed. The sonar image showed a faint figure in the center, humanoid, motionless, too symmetrical to be debris. The system froze soon after capturing the image, and the file corrupted before backup. The lead researcher, Dr. Ellen Page, later claimed she began hearing a child's laughter in her field recordings, sounds not present during the original session. She left the project weeks later, refusing to discuss it again. To this day, no one builds near Harlan Hollow. The forest has reclaimed everything: the Calhoun Shack, the old road, even the creek that once glistened under the moonlight now lies stagnant and dark. On cold nights, travelers along Route 119 sometimes hear a boy's voice on the wind, faint and pleading. "Don't go," it says. "It's not done yet." Some claim they've seen him standing at the edge of the road, a pale child with hollow eyes and a water-soaked shirt, staring at passing cars. Those who stop say the temperature drops instantly, the air thickens, and the smell of sulfur fills their nose. And when they blink, the boy is gone, leaving only wet footprints that fade one by one, as if the earth is taking him back. Locals say the hollow was cursed the day the miners cut into its roots, that something ancient and hungry awoke beneath it. Whatever it is, it seems to take only the curious, those who wander too far into silence. Every few years, a hiker vanishes, a tent is found empty, or a lost pet never returns. And though the county denies any connection, every search party that's gone in after dark reports hearing the same thing. A small voice calling softly through the mist, echoing between the trees. A boy's voice, gentle but wrong, a voice that always seems too close. And if you listen long enough, they say, it stops calling for help and starts calling your name. In the summer of 2012, a young couple, Casey and Brian Holt, came to the gorge for a long weekend of camping and photography. They had been married for only a year, and this trip was meant to be an escape from the noise of city life. Casey was a nature photographer, and Brian loved to explore abandoned places, which the gorge has plenty of: old mining paths, forgotten moonshine stills, and rusting cabins being slowly devoured by moss. On their second night, after a long hike through the Oxier Ridge Trail, they set up camp in a secluded hollow near an unmarked cave mouth. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of rain and earth, and somewhere far off, thunder rolled lazily through the mountains. They lit a small fire, shared a bottle of bourbon, and watched the fireflies blink between the trees. It was peaceful, until the forest began to grow too still. At first, they thought the quiet was just part of the storm's approach. But soon Casey realized she couldn't even hear the crickets. The air had turned unnaturally cold, and when Brian tossed another log onto the fire, the flame sputtered violently, bending as if pulled by an unseen current. Then came the smell, a wet metallic odor that carried a hint of decay. Casey lifted her camera instinctively, its flash slicing through the dark, and in that split second of light, she swore she saw figures standing at the edge of the trees, pale, narrow shapes, their limbs too long, faces smooth and featureless like unfinished porcelain. The firelight seemed to recoil from them, as if refusing to touch their skin. When Brian called out, the figures tilted their heads in unison, their motion slow, deliberate, and utterly silent. Then, without a sound, they stepped back into the shadows, vanishing between the trunks as though the forest had swallowed them whole. The couple didn't sleep that night. They sat together by the dying fire until dawn, listening to the forest breathe around them. By morning, their campsite was undisturbed, yet the ground near the cave was covered in strange footprints, not human, not animal. Each print was narrow, Coal Hollow sits tucked deep in the folds of Virginia's Appalachian Mountains, an old mining settlement that time forgot. In the early 1900s, this valley was alive with the thunder of coal carts and the shouts of men working underground. But when the mine collapsed in 1932, killing more than 40 workers, the company sealed the tunnels and left the town to rot. What remained were hollowed-out homes, a broken church, and the whispers of the dead beneath the ground. Locals still say that on quiet nights, if the wind comes from the east, you can hear the mountain breathe, slow, deep, and mournful. They call that sound the Whistler of Coal Hollow. It began, as most Appalachian legends do, with something small, a noise that didn't belong. In the winter of 1978, a local man named Travis Gentry was walking home after closing the general store. The moon was hidden behind clouds and snow blanketed the valley in a dull white glow. He was halfway across the old wooden bridge when he heard it, a long, low whistle rising from the holler below. It wasn't human. It had a strange, wavering tone, almost like someone whistling through water. The sound echoed up through the trees, steady and haunting, each note drawn out longer than the last. Travis froze. The whistle came again, closer this time, followed by the faint crunch of snow. He turned toward the path leading down into the gorge, but there was nothing, just shadows moving between the trees. He swore he saw a faint figure at the tree line, tall and thin, its head tilted back as if it were listening to its own sound. Then the whistle stopped, and so did the wind. Travis told no one that night, but 2 days later his brother Henry went missing. His truck was found abandoned near the same bridge, keys still in the ignition, driver's door wide open. The police searched for weeks, but no tracks were ever found in the snow, as though Henry had simply vanished into the white. Locals began to whisper that the Whistler had taken him as payment for disturbing the valley. Travis became obsessed with finding answers. He started wandering the woods at night, carrying a lantern and an old recorder, trying to capture the sound again. What he found instead was silence, until one night in February of that same year, he didn't come home. A search party found his lantern on the frozen path, glass cracked, wick still warm. His footprints led down into the hollow and ended abruptly near an old mine vent, a rusted grate barely visible under the snow. When one of the rescuers leaned down to inspect it, a faint whistling rose from the dark shaft below. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too human. It rose and fell in perfect rhythm, echoing against the iron and stone, filling the valley with a sound that made every man's stomach turn cold. No one dared to open the vent. They sealed it tighter the next morning. Years passed, and Coal Hollow became a ghost town. The last few families moved away in the 1980s, leaving only decaying houses and sagging mine entrances. But every now and then, someone driving along the mountain road at night would report hearing it, the whistle, slow and hollow, following them for miles through the pines. Some said it mimicked whatever tune they were humming or whistling, almost playfully. Others said it would start before they made a sound, as if it already knew what song they were thinking of. In 2011, a group of urban explorers entered the area to film an abandoned places documentary. They spent the night near the mine ruins, filming old equipment and rusted rail tracks. On their footage, the kind only noticed when they reviewed it later, there's a moment where one of them, a young woman named Ellie, stops and asks if anyone else hears that faint tune. Her camera shakes slightly, and somewhere in the background, just under the sound of their breathing, a low whistle carries through the wind. It rises, almost curious, before the audio cuts out entirely. The group swore they heard nothing at the time. 2 months later, Ellie disappeared during a solo shoot in another part of Appalachia. Her last voicemail to a friend was short, just 5 seconds of static and a soft, drawn-out whistle. Today, no one goes near Coal Hollow after dusk. The bridge has collapsed and the mine entrances are sealed under decades of rock. Yet hunters and hikers still report hearing something strange in the distance, a sound that doesn't fade with the wind. Locals say it's not a warning, not even a ghost, it's a call. The Whistler isn't searching for the living. It's calling to the ones who've already gone missing, guiding them deeper into the earth where the light can't follow. Some say if you ever hear it answer your own tune, you must stop immediately, cover your ears, and walk away. Because once the Whistler learns your song, it never stops singing it back. By 2021, the legend of the Whistler had become more than a campfire story. It was a local taboo. Old-timers in Wise County refused to even say the name aloud after sundown. They'd lower their voices and cross themselves if anyone mentioned the hollow, muttering that the mountain remembers. But to a young filmmaker named Mark Weaver, it was the perfect subject for his Appalachian folklore series. Mark had grown up in nearby Big Stone Gap, and his grandmother used to warn him never to whistle in the woods after dark. She said it invited something that wasn't human to listen back. He never believed it, not until he started digging into the Coal Hollow disappearances. There were dozens of reports spanning nearly a century. Miners, hikers, vagrants, even 2 surveyors from the 1950s who'd vanished near the old mining road. Each case had the same detail: witnesses hearing a strange melodic whistling sound moments before the person went missing. The pitch varied, but the pattern was always the same: 5 slow notes, rising and falling like a mournful tune. Mark went into Coal Hollow with 3 friends: his sound engineer, Brooke, his cameraman, Tyler, and a local historian, Mr. Samuel Grant, who was in his 70s and had worked at the mine as a boy. They camped near the frozen stream below the ridge where Travis Gentry's lantern had been found decades earlier. The place felt wrong from the start. The trees grew too close together, their trunks twisted by years of wind and frost. Even in daylight, the gorge was unnaturally quiet. No birds, no movement, just the faint sound of running water and the crunch of their boots. That first evening, Brooke set up directional mics around the perimeter to capture ambient sound. The equipment kept cutting out, batteries draining faster than normal. Around midnight, Mark heard something faint through the headphones, a thin, airy whistle that came and went in the wind, almost like someone humming from far away. He removed the headset and turned toward the ridge, but the air was still. When they played the recording back later, they realized the sound wasn't in the background. It was layered over their own breathing. Closer than they thought. They pressed deeper into the gorge the next morning, following an old cart trail until they found a collapsed shaft, its mouth half swallowed by mud and roots. Mr. Grant froze when he saw it. He said that was the old number 3 tunnel, the one sealed after the explosion. A chill passed through the group as they noticed something etched into the remaining planks. A set of deep, deliberate grooves, spaced like tally marks. Beneath them, someone had scratched a crude shape, 5 uneven lines curving upward, like the notes of a musical scale. That night, a storm rolled through the mountains. Rain fell hard against the tent walls, and the wind screamed down the valley. Around 3 a.m., Brooke shook Mark awake. She said she heard whistling outside the tent. They listened, and sure enough, through the hiss of rain, there it was, slow, deliberate, rising and falling. The sound seemed to move from tree to tree, circling their camp, stopping each time one of them spoke. Tyler unzipped the tent flap and pointed his flashlight toward the ridge, and for a split second they all saw it. A tall, gaunt silhouette standing by the stream, its head tilted back, motionless. When the light hit it, the figure simply disappeared. By dawn, the storm had passed and the hollow was quiet again. They packed up in silence and left without speaking of what they saw. But something followed them. Over the next week, as they edited their footage, a faint whistling could be heard beneath every audio track, constant, rhythmic, as if recorded from somewhere impossibly close to the microphone. They tried isolating the sound, filtering it out, but each attempt made it clearer. On the final cut of the video, just before the image fades to black, the whistle rises sharply, and a soft voice, faint but distinct. Deep within the rolling green wilderness of Tennessee's Appalachian spine runs a narrow stream called Lost Creek. For decades, it's been known to locals as a place where the forest feels wrong, too still, too watchful, as if the trees themselves are listening. Lost Creek winds through dense pine and hemlock thickets before disappearing into an underground cavern system. The caves are natural and ancient, carved by centuries of rushing water, and in their depths, the air hums with a strange, low vibration. The Cherokee once called this place Aniwaya's Mouth, the hollow where voices sleep. Settlers renamed it Lost Creek after a series of vanishings in the late 1800s, children who wandered too close to the water and were never seen again. The first modern account came in the summer of 1973, when a farmer named James Lattimore reported hearing children laughing in the woods behind his property. It was just after sunset, and he could see nothing through the mist rising off the creek. The laughter echoed strangely, too rhythmic, too steady, repeating the same short bursts again and again. James assumed it was the neighbors' kids playing by the water, but when he walked closer, the sounds moved, always staying the same distance ahead of him, deeper into the forest. When he finally reached the creek, the air turned cold. The laughter stopped. He swore he heard small feet running through the shallows. And then, just before the silence fell completely, a whisper in his ear, a child's voice, soft and close. "You found us." He turned, but no one was there. By morning, his dogs refused to go near the water. Their fur stood on end, and they whimpered whenever the wind blew from that direction. Over the following weeks, other families along the creek began reporting similar experiences. Children's laughter, small wet footprints on porches, toys vanishing from yards. The sheriff dismissed it as superstition until one of the local boys, 8-year-old Daniel Cooper, disappeared while fishing with his father. The man said he only turned his back for a minute. Daniel's line was still in the water, his little boots sitting neatly on the riverbank, but there were no tracks leading away. Only a single set of prints coming out of the creek, smaller than a child's and spaced unevenly, as if whatever made them wasn't used to walking upright. The community searched for weeks, combing the woods and draining part of the creek. They found nothing. Then, one night, 2 volunteers camping near the search site awoke to soft giggling just outside their tent. One of them unzipped the flap and froze. There, standing at the edge of the firelight, was a child, pale, soaked, eyes black as river stones. It smiled at them, lips blue, skin wrinkled like it had been underwater too long. Behind it, half glimpsed in the fog, stood more shapes, smaller figures watching from the trees. When the man shouted, the figures scattered. But instead of running away, they dove into the earth itself, sinking silently into the mud as if it were water. For years, Lost Creek became a forbidden place. Locals built fences and posted signs warning strangers not to wander near the water after dark. But stories persisted. In 1999, spelunkers exploring the underground caverns beneath the area discovered something horrifying. Deep inside one of the tunnels, nearly half a mile underground, they found a narrow chamber filled with what looked like old wooden toys, dolls, spinning tops, and carved animals, all arranged neatly in a circle around a small pool of still water. The toys dated back over a century, preserved perfectly by the cold air. But the most disturbing discovery was what lay beneath the water. When one of the explorers shined his flashlight into the pool, dozens of small faces stared back at him, childlike, translucent, pressed against the underside of the surface as though trapped in the reflection. The footage was never released publicly. The team claimed it was too disturbing, though a few seconds leaked online years later. A dim, shaky clip showing what appears to be a pale hand rising just below the water before the camera cuts out. The state closed off the cave soon after, citing structural instability. Still, hikers and campers who wander too close to Lost Creek say the sound of laughter carries on certain nights. Faint but clear, even when the air is perfectly still. Some say if you follow it, it leads you to the water, where the reflection doesn't always match what's standing above it. Old-timers in the nearby town of Sparta warn travelers with the same words their grandparents once used. If you hear the children of Lost Creek, don't answer. Don't speak. Don't look in the water. Because once they know you've heard them, they'll never stop calling you back. In 2020, Lost Creek found itself back in the public eye when a small YouTube team called Southern Shadows decided to document its folklore. The group specialized in Appalachian hauntings, but they treated the stories like serious field research. No jump scares, no special effects, just raw footage and interviews with locals. Their lead host, Evan Brooks, was a Tennessee native who had grown up hearing whispers about the children of Lost Creek, but had always assumed it was an exaggerated ghost tale. He spent months gathering old reports, police records, and family accounts dating as far back as the early 1900s. What unsettled him most was the pattern. Every 40 to 50 years, there was a new wave of disappearances, usually children, and always near the same stretch of water. The most recent was in 1982. By his estimate, the next cycle should have begun again around 2022. The crew arrived at Lost Creek in late October. Evan, his camerawoman Talia, and their sound technician Marcus. They interviewed the few remaining residents near the hollow, most of whom refused to be filmed. One old man, Elijah McGreedy, agreed to speak on record, but made them promise to leave before dark. He said he'd once seen the children himself back in the 1960s when he was a boy. His cousin had gone missing that summer, and Elijah swore he'd seen her again a week later, standing in the creek at dawn. She was barefoot, smiling faintly, her hair dripping with mud and algae. He called out to her, and she tilted her head, still smiling, before stepping backward into the water. He said she didn't sink. She simply vanished beneath the ripples like mist. Elijah's voice shook as he described the last thing he heard before she disappeared. Laughter, soft and distant, echoing from under the ground. That night, the crew camped by the river's edge. They set up thermal cameras, motion sensors, and underwater microphones. The footage from those first few hours was uneventful. Crickets, running water, the hum of the forest. But around 2:13 a.m., one of the hydrophones picked up something strange. Faint whispers beneath the current, layered voices that sounded like children singing. The melody was uneven, almost like a nursery rhyme that had lost its rhythm over time. Marcus boosted the audio levels, and the voices grew clearer, overlapping phrases, words repeated in a child's tone. Come play. Stay with us. Come play. Talia, shaken but determined, began filming the creek. On the thermal camera, she noticed sudden drops in temperature along the waterline, patches of ice-cold air moving in circular patterns, like invisible figures pacing. The ripples in the water began to distort, forming faint outlines, small hands pressing just below the surface. Evan leaned over the bank, calling out softly, asking if anyone was there. The response came in the form of laughter, high-pitched, breathy, and coming from both sides of the creek at once. Then the current slowed, unnaturally still, as if the water itself was holding its breath. Marcus yelled for Evan to step back just as a small figure rose from the creek, translucent, water pouring from its hair, eyes hollow and black. It opened its mouth, but no sound came. The microphones, however, registered something, a deafening burst of static that spiked every piece of audio equipment before cutting the power entirely. Along the Blue Ridge Mountains, there's a narrow ridge trail the locals call Devil's Backbone. It's a dangerous twisting route, steep drops, crumbling ledges, and thick fog that rolls in without warning. The name comes from the shape of the mountain itself, a long, jagged line of rock that looks like the spine of something ancient buried beneath the forest. Few hikers travel it now, though in the 1950s it was a popular shortcut for hunters and loggers. That changed after a string of disappearances, each stranger than the last. People began speaking of a figure that appeared only in the heaviest fog, tall, impossibly thin, with skin as pale as bone and eyes like polished glass. They called him the Pale Man of Devil's Backbone. The first recorded sighting came from a man named Arthur Cole, a surveyor for the Highway Department in 1954. He and his partner had been mapping the ridgeline when the fog closed in. They decided to make camp and wait it out. Arthur reported hearing footsteps pacing around their tent that night, slow, deliberate, and heavy, as though someone was dragging a long limb behind them. When he looked outside, he saw nothing but mist. The next morning, his partner was gone. The only sign of him was a torn section of fabric hanging from a branch 20 feet above the trail, as if he'd been lifted and dropped there. Arthur swore he heard something laughing softly through the fog, not human laughter, but low, breathy, almost hollow. He quit his job 2 weeks later and never returned to the Backbone. Over the decades, sightings continued. Hunters reported seeing a white shadow moving between trees, sometimes following them for miles. Campers would find strange, elongated handprints pressed into the dirt outside their tents. A few even claimed that when the fog grew thick enough, the air itself seemed to vibrate. A deep, pulsing hum that made their vision blur and their skin crawl. But the strangest case came in 1997, when 2 college students from Boone disappeared while hiking the trail for a photography project. Their camera was later found near the cliff's edge, cracked but intact. The final image on the roll showed the forest swallowed in fog, and faintly in the distance a tall, pale figure standing at the edge of the ridge, its body stretched unnaturally thin, its face featureless except for 2 faint, reflective eyes. Locals say the Pale Man isn't a ghost. He's something older, born from the mountain itself, a guardian, or perhaps a punishment. There's an old Cherokee legend about a spirit called Unalan VSDI, the White Watcher, said to live in the mist between worlds. Those who wander too far into the fog without respect for the land are taken, not killed, but absorbed into the mountain, their souls stretched thin like mist until nothing remains. The ridge's unique echo patterns give the illusion of voices following you, but some who've been there at night swear those echoes answer back. In 2018, a local park ranger named Sarah Nolan was assigned to survey the ridge after reports of strange lights. Her radio log recorded something unnerving. Around 11:47 p.m., she reported visual distortion in the fog and said she could see a figure walking uphill toward her position. Dispatch asked her to describe it, but her words broke into static. Only one phrase came through clearly. "It's taller than the trees." Her body was never recovered. The next morning, her flashlight and notebook were found in a clearing. The last entry read, "The fog isn't moving anymore. It's breathing." In 2022, the story of the Pale Man caught the attention of Blue Ridge Paranormal, a small group of Appalachian researchers who specialized in local hauntings. The team consisted of two brothers, Eli and Gabe Whitman, and their friend Rachel Porter, a journalist who had grown up hearing about Devil's Backbone from her grandfather. Determined to document the legend once and for all, they hiked the ridge in late November, a time of year when the fog was thickest. They set up camp near the halfway point, where the trail narrowed into a cliffside path. Drones wouldn't work. GPS signals failed almost immediately. Eli joked that it felt like the mountain didn't want them there. None of them laughed. That night, the temperature dropped without warning. Rachel recorded the sound of footsteps echoing through the fog, faint at first, then circling their camp. Gabe shined his flashlight outward, but the beam dissolved in the mist. He swore he saw movement, a tall shadow shifting just beyond the tree line. Then the sound changed. It wasn't footsteps anymore. It was breathing, long, hollow, almost mechanical, as if the mountain itself had lungs. Rachel whispered that her camera lens was fogging from the inside. When Eli tried to turn on the lantern, the flame stretched sideways, bending towards something unseen. They didn't sleep that night. At dawn, the fog hadn't lifted. It seemed thicker, heavier, almost tactile. The team began to descend, following the path by compass. But after an hour of walking, the ridge looped back to the same clearing they'd left. The compass needle spun wildly. Rachel started recording audio logs, her voice trembling. "Something's following us," she said. "It doesn't walk. It glides." The recording captured faint whispers layered beneath her voice. Low, distorted tones repeating her words half a second later, as if mocking her. Gabe vanished shortly after that. One moment he was ahead on the trail, and the next, his flashlight beam disappeared into the fog. Eli and Rachel searched for hours, calling his name, but the echoes never returned. It was as if the air swallowed their voices. When rescue teams found their abandoned camp 2 days later, the only evidence was Rachel's camera wedged between two rocks near the cliff's edge. The footage was grainy, but one frame showed something impossible: the outline of a man, or something like one, standing inside the fog. Its limbs were too long, fingers dragging against the ground. Its head tilted slowly toward the lens, revealing a smooth, featureless face. Then the camera shook violently before cutting out. Today, hikers still find strange footprints along the backbone. Long, narrow impressions too deep to belong to any animal. On certain nights, the fog refuses to move, hanging over the ridge like a living thing. Locals say the Pale Man isn't hunting. He's waiting for the next traveler to step too far into the mist, for the next echo to answer him back. The investigation into Blue Ridge Paranormal's disappearance was officially closed after 6 weeks. Authorities ruled it an accidental misadventure, citing weather conditions and poor visibility as the cause. But the rescuers who went up there spoke differently in private. One, an older ranger named Tommy Garrett, told the local paper, the Boone Herald, that he'd seen something he couldn't explain. He described walking through dense fog near the ridge when he came across a tree that looked burned from the inside out. The bark wasn't blackened on the surface. It glowed faintly from within, as though something had seared it hollow. And in the soil beneath it, he found 3 parallel grooves running down the slope, each spaced perfectly apart, like fingers dragging through mud. The pattern went on for nearly 40 feet before disappearing into the fog. Garrett retired the following month and refused to talk about the backbone again. But the strangest account came from Deputy Ruth Callahan, who was stationed in Watauga County in 2023. She had been assigned to patrol the forest perimeter after multiple hikers reported screams echoing down the ridge at night. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia lies a forgotten settlement called Ravens Hollow. Once a coal town, it was abandoned in the 1960s after a mine collapse killed nearly 40 workers. The entrances were sealed, the houses boarded, and the town slowly vanished under moss and mist. but those who live in the nearby valleys still whisper about what happens when the sun dips below the ridges, when the fog rises from the old shafts and a faint orange light begins to move through the trees. They call it the Lantern Man. According to local legend, the Lantern Man is the spirit of Silas Breyer, a mine foreman who refused to evacuate during the collapse. The story goes that when the supports gave way, Silas stayed behind to guide his men toward the exit with his lantern, buying them time as the tunnels caved in. His body was never recovered. Some said he was buried alive. Others claimed he kept walking deeper into the mines, chasing the faint glow of a second lantern that shouldn't have been there. Weeks later, when rescue teams finally reopened the entrance, they found the walls blackened as if burned from within, but no fire had ever been reported. For decades after the disaster, hikers and campers began to see strange lights flickering through the hollow, moving too smoothly to be flashlights, too deliberate to be reflections. They'd hear the sound of boots scraping over gravel and the faint metallic clink of a miner's lamp. One old trapper, Walter Dean, told police in 1974 that a man carrying a lantern had followed him for 2 miles through the trees. He never said a word, Walter recalled, but every time I looked back, he was closer. The light didn't shine on him, it shone through him. Walter left the mountain that night and never returned. Locals claim the Lantern Man appears most often near the collapsed mine entrance. His light drifts through the fog, steady and rhythmic, as though searching for something or someone. Those who've seen it say the glow is strange, almost chemical, like molten metal, and when it gets close, the air smells faintly of sulfur and wet stone. Some say if you follow the light, you'll hear voices whispering through the trees, not in English, but in the slow, echoing language of men speaking underground. And once you hear that, it's already too late to turn back. The most chilling account came from State Trooper Michael Rowe in 1991. Rowe had been sent to investigate reports of illegal night miners in the Ravens Hollow area. He parked his cruiser near the old rail line and began walking with a flashlight and radio. Around midnight, he reported seeing a single lantern light approximately 50 yards ahead, moving uphill. Dispatch asked him to identify himself, but Rowe replied, "He's not answering. I think he's signaling." His radio then cut out. When backup arrived the next morning, Rowe was found unconscious near the sealed mine entrance. His flashlight battery had melted into the casing, and the front of his uniform was dusted with black soot. He claimed to remember little, only the sound of breathing, the smell of fire, and a voice that whispered, "Keep digging." In 2015, a YouTuber named Ethan Hale decided to explore the area for a paranormal documentary. He live-streamed his hike to an audience of nearly 8,000 viewers, mocking the stories as Appalachian ghost tales for the bored and lonely. For most of the stream, nothing happened until the fog rolled in around 10:40 p.m. The audience watched as Ethan's camera began to shake, the image flickering. Then a faint orange light appeared in the distance. "Looks like someone's out there," he laughed nervously. "Guess I'm not alone after all." He walked toward it, joking that maybe he'd find Silas's ghost. The chat flooded with warnings, viewers begging him to turn back. The light flickered once, twice, then went out completely. The final thing the viewers heard was Ethan's voice whispering, "Wait, there's more than one light." The stream went black. A week later, authorities found his phone wedged between 2 rocks near the mine entrance. The last frame of the recording showed a cave wall illuminated by multiple orange glows, as if several lanterns were burning in the dark. The bodies were never found. Those who live near Ravens Hollow say the Lantern Man is no longer alone. On certain fog-heavy nights, multiple lights move through the valley, weaving between trees like fireflies, but colder, steadier, always in pairs. The sound of pickaxes echoes faintly in the distance, and if you listen closely, you can hear the rhythm of shovels scraping against rock. Some swear they've seen silhouettes inside the glow, men in old miners' helmets, faces smeared with soot, eyes hollow and bright as flame. Geologists have tried to explain the lights as pockets of natural gas igniting under pressure, a phenomenon known as marsh fire. But that doesn't explain the footprints found in the mud, boot prints leading out of the old mine and stopping abruptly, as if their owners simply vanished mid-step. Nor does it explain why the air near the mine sometimes grows hot enough to warp metal tools. or why the ground occasionally vibrates like something is still moving deep below. In 2021, a local maintenance crew was tasked with inspecting a new logging road that cut close to Ravens Hollow. One of them, Charlie Kemp, later told a podcaster that as he and his team were packing up at dusk, a light appeared in the tree line, steady, golden, and silent. Thinking it was another crew, they waved. The light paused, flickered twice, then began to approach. Charlie said the air changed. It grew thick and hot, like standing too close to a furnace. One of his men shouted, "That's not a lamp!" And the light surged forward, splitting into several smaller flames that drifted between them. Charlie described feeling an immense pressure in his chest, as though the air had turned solid. When he woke up, the others were gone. Their gear was scattered across the site, and his own watch had stopped at 11:47 p.m. Today, no one lives within 10 miles of Ravens Hollow. The forest has reclaimed what was once a bustling town. The mine entrances are sealed, but every few years hikers still report seeing faint orange glows moving through the trees. Some say it's Silas Breyer still searching for a way out. Others whisper it's not him at all. It's the mine itself, alive and feeding on those who wander too close. Because down there in the dark, the coal never stopped burning. And if you ever find yourself driving through West Virginia on a foggy night and see a lantern light flickering on the roadside, don't stop. Don't look. Just keep driving, because in Ravens Hollow the dead don't rest. They're still working the night shift. The story of the Lantern Man grew darker in 2023 when a paranormal investigation team called Appalachian Shadows decided to spend a week in Ravens Hollow. The team, consisting of 2 local guides, a sound engineer named Maya Collins and a filmmaker, Trent Reynolds, set up camp near the sealed mine entrances. Their goal was to document the folklore in real time using thermal cameras, night vision lenses, and high-sensitivity microphones. On the first night, nothing happened. Just the whisper of the wind through decaying shacks and the distant call of a barred owl. But the mountain had other plans. Around midnight on the second night, the fog rolled in thick, heavier than any natural mist. The air smelled of coal dust and wet earth. The microphones began picking up faint metallic tapping, like a pickaxe striking rock, and low, uneven breathing. Trent walked toward the sound, camera rolling, and saw a faint orange glow through the trees. He assumed it was another camper, but as he moved closer, the glow split into multiple lights. Nestled deep in the hills of eastern Kentucky, the narrow valley known as Smoky Hollow is a place where the fog lingers long after sunrise, and the air smells faintly of coal smoke, even decades after the last mine closed. In the late 1800s, it was a bustling coal town with a single rail line connecting it to the outside world. Trains thundered through the valley day and night, hauling timber and coal, their whistles echoing off the steep ridges. But the valley also became infamous for accidents, landslides, and unexplained vanishings. After the mines shut down in the 1930s, locals reported strange phenomena along the tracks: ghostly locomotives, phantom whistles, and spectral miners walking the rails long after the town was abandoned. One of the earliest documented reports came in 1942. A train engineer named Samuel Griggs was driving a coal shipment through the valley when he saw what he thought was another locomotive blocking the track. He blew the whistle and applied the brakes, but the engine kept moving, impossibly fast, with no lights in its cab and no engineer at the controls. Samuel swore he saw figures leaning out of the windows. Pale men in coal dust-stained overalls, their eyes hollow and glowing faintly. His brakes failed for a full half minute, and by the time he regained control, the phantom train had vanished into the fog. He described hearing a faint, distorted whistle echoing in his ears for hours afterward, long after he'd left the valley. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, other witnesses came forward: railroad workers, hikers, and even hunters. Some reported hearing a train whistle in the distance when no tracks were in use. Others said they saw lights moving along the rails at impossible speeds. In 1978, a teenage couple camping near the tracks claimed they watched an entire train pass by in silence. The cars were empty, yet each window was filled with shadowy figures who stared directly at them. The teens froze, and when the train disappeared behind the ridge, they found that their campfire had gone cold and their blankets wet as if soaked by fog, though no rain had fallen. The valley's legend intensified in 1993 when a crew of geologists surveying abandoned mines near Smoky Hollow recorded something that would never fully be explained. Their thermal cameras and audio equipment picked up faint rhythmic clanging, like steel striking stone, along with the unmistakable sound of a train whistle. But there were no tracks in the immediate area, and the readings suggested the sound originated from multiple sources simultaneously, moving and stopping at impossible intervals. The team reported a feeling of pressure on their chests, as though the valley itself was leaning down toward them. Some claimed shadows flickered in peripheral vision, even when no one else was in line of sight. Hikers and residents today report seeing phantom trains under specific conditions: fog thick enough to obscure visibility, wind blowing through the valley, and the smell of coal in the air. Sometimes the whistle is heard first, a long, mournful sound that seems to come from everywhere at once. Shadows of figures appear moving along the abandoned tracks, sometimes walking along the ties, other times leaning out of invisible cars. A few claim the trains replay events from the valley's past: the night of a derailment, a landslide, or an explosion in the mine. Those who follow the sounds too closely say they end up disoriented, wandering the hills until the fog lifts and the echoes fade, sometimes hours later, sometimes never seen again. One of the most chilling accounts came from a long-haul trucker named Eli Turner in 2010. Driving through Smoky Hollow at 1 a.m., he noticed a light ahead, the unmistakable glow of a train. He applied the brakes, but the lights moved as if on a parallel track, keeping pace with his truck. He rolled down the window and heard a distorted whistle, shrill and metallic, layered over his engine noise. He claimed he saw spectral miners walking alongside, carrying lanterns and pickaxes, their faces obscured by shadows. By the time he reached the main highway, the lights and sounds vanished, leaving him trembling, alone, and unsure whether he had actually driven the mile-long stretch, or if hours had passed in mere moments. The phantom trains of Smoky Hollow remain an enduring mystery. Authorities dismiss most reports as hoaxes or natural echoes in the valley, yet the sheer number of witnesses spanning decades makes skepticism difficult to maintain. Modern hikers, photographers, and paranormal enthusiasts continue to seek out the tracks, hoping to capture evidence. The locals, however, know better. They warn that the valley keeps its secrets and that the trains aren't merely reflections of the past. They're something alive, replaying tragedies, dragging the lost souls of the hollow along their spectral rails. In 2019, a small investigative team from Appalachian Anomalies decided to explore Smoky Hollow, determined to document the legendary phantom trains. The team consisted of Hannah Brooks, an experienced hiker and folklore researcher, Jonah Pierce, a sound engineer, and Levi Carter, a local videographer familiar with the valley. They arrived in late October, when the fog was thickest, covering the tracks and the remains of old coal shacks. For the first night, the valley was silent, only the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional owl's call breaking the stillness. But on the second night, the legend awoke. Around 1:47 a.m., Hannah reported hearing a distant, low whistle. Jonah and Levi strained to listen as the sound grew, layered, overlapping, echoing unnaturally through the hills. Then, in the thermal cameras, a glowing shape appeared, stretching across the valley. The outline was unmistakably a train, long, segmented, moving without sound at first. As it approached, they could hear the metallic screech of wheels on invisible rails, the faint creak of carriages, and the echo of human voices chanting in a low, guttural rhythm. Shadows moved along the cars, figures hunched over, carrying lanterns, their forms elongated and spectral. Every time Jonah tried to zoom in with the night vision camera, the figures seemed to blur, reshaping themselves in the fog. Hannah, feeling drawn to the apparition, stepped closer to the old track bed. The air grew thick, heavy, vibrating as if the valley itself was pulsing. She could smell coal and damp earth, a scent stronger than anything natural, almost choking. As the train seemed to slow, the figures became more distinct. Faces pale, eyes hollow, lips moving in silent screams. Levy caught the most disturbing image, one of the spectral miners reaching through the air as if grasping at him. Jonah swore he felt a cold hand brush his shoulder, even though the cameras revealed no one nearby. The train passed through the valley in what seemed like minutes, yet their watches had stopped entirely, frozen at 1:52 a.m. When the fog lifted hours later, the valley was empty. Only the old tracks and footprints pressed into the mud remained. Over the next several weeks, the team reviewed their recordings. The footage revealed anomalies impossible to explain naturally. Thermal distortions moving independently of physical objects, faint echoes of whistles that persisted after the cameras recorded nothing, and brief glimpses of figures embedded in the fog, dissolving before analysis could catch them. Locals warned that the phantom trains were not simply replaying past tragedies. They lured the curious, pulling them into the valley's folds. Anyone who followed too closely risked vanishing like the miners they portrayed, trapped in an endless loop of rails and fog. Hannah and Levi eventually left the valley, shaken and forever changed. But Jonah stayed behind for one last recording attempt. The footage ended abruptly. The camera caught a long, ghostly train, with dozens of spectral miners leaning out of the sides, all staring directly at the lens. The final frame showed the train stretching into the fog, dissolving into a pulse of orange light, and one hand, elongated, coal-black, almost skeletal, reaching outward toward the viewer. The video went viral among paranormal circles, but the valley itself remained quiet, watching, waiting for the next visitor. Smoky Hollow continues to claim its legends. Hikers and travelers report hearing distant whistles, seeing glowing figures along the abandoned tracks, and feeling a presence guiding them deeper into the fog. Some swear that when you follow the sound too closely, the valley reshapes itself, stretching miles into minutes, twisting paths, and trapping wanderers in an endless loop of echoing coal dust and ghostly rails. The phantom trains are said to be alive, replaying the tragedies of the past and still seeking new souls to add to their spectral convoy. In the remote forests of southwestern Virginia lies a valley locals call Black Hollow. Thick stands of oak and maple obscure the sky, and fog clings to the ground even in the heat of summer. The hollow has a reputation older than most towns in the region. Settlers spoke of unexplainable disappearances, livestock found torn apart without a trace of predators, and strange, mournful howls echoing through the night. By the 1930s, the valley had earned the moniker the Howling Hollow among local law enforcement and hunters. Those who lived near the edges of the forest learned early to stay indoors after sundown, especially when the wind carried the scent of damp earth and decay. The earliest documented account comes from Sheriff Caleb Whitaker, who patrolled the area in 1937. He reported a series of vanishings. 4 men from neighboring homesteads disappeared over the course of 2 weeks. The only clue, guttural howls heard at night, low and stretching across the valley like the wind itself was speaking. Whitaker himself claimed to have been awakened one night by an unnatural howl, louder than anything the forest should produce. Following the sound with his lantern, he described seeing a figure at the edge of the tree line. impossibly tall, hunched, with glowing amber eyes that reflected the light. When he called out, the figure vanished and the howl abruptly stopped. Whitaker noted in his journal that he had never heard a wolf or coyote that sounded like that. The cry was human and animal at the same time. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the hollow gained notoriety among hunters and hikers. One family camping near the creek reported hearing the howls rise to a crescendo, then drop into silence, only to start again closer to their tent. They claimed to see silhouettes moving through the trees. Thin, shadowy figures with elongated limbs and heads tilted unnaturally. Their dog bolted into the forest, and when they searched for it, it was gone, leaving only paw prints that led to the creek and stopped abruptly in the mud. The family never returned to Black Hollow. In 1999, a park ranger named Martha Collins patrolling the old logging roads captured audio that would become infamous among paranormal circles. The recordings contained a series of howls layered in a disturbing pattern, rising and falling in pitch, sometimes mimicking human speech. Some fragments sounded like calls for help, while others were distorted laughter. When Martha played back the audio, she noticed that every howl seemed to follow a rhythm, almost as if the forest itself was orchestrating the sounds. She reported feeling an overwhelming pressure in the valley, as though unseen eyes were watching, measuring her every movement. The most chilling account came in 2015, when a team of adventurers exploring the hollow overnight reported encountering the source of the howling. They described a creature standing in a clearing, at least 10 feet tall, thin, with glowing amber eyes. Its limbs were unnaturally long, hands dragging along the ground, and its mouth opened impossibly wide as it let out a deafening scream. The adventurers ran, but the howls seemed to follow them, not carried by the wind, but emanating from every tree and stone around them. By morning, they were found at the edge of the forest, disoriented, shaking, and unable to account for nearly 6 hours of missing time. Locals believe the hollow is cursed, a place where the veil between the living and the unnatural is thin. The howls are said to be warnings, or perhaps lures, drawing wanderers deeper into the valley. Some speculate the creatures are spirits of those who vanished decades ago, twisted over time by the forest itself. Others insist they are predators older than the settlers, something alive and intelligent, hunting in the darkness. Even today, travelers report hearing low, echoing howls when passing near the hollow at night. Some swear that if you stop and listen, the howls respond, shifting pitch, rising and falling as if mocking or beckoning. A few hikers have reported seeing glowing eyes among the trees, watching silently as they flee. The legend of Black Hollow persists, a chilling reminder that in Appalachia, even the forest can harbor secrets too dark to understand. In the late fall of 2022, a small investigative team called Midnight Appalachia ventured into Black Hollow, determined to document its infamous howls. The team consisted of Claire Emerson, a folklorist, Dylan Hayes, a sound engineer, and Mason Reed, a wildlife photographer familiar with the region. They arrived in the early evening, setting up camp near a meandering creek deep in the valley, where fog clung to the ground and the skeletal branches of oak trees scraped against each other in the cold wind. The forest was unusually silent at first, no rustling leaves, no distant owl calls, only the faint gurgle of water. Claire noted the stillness in her journal, writing that the hollow was listening before it spoke. Around 11:30 p.m., the first sounds appeared, faint at first, like the low moan of a wolf, carried across the valley in uneven bursts. Dylan's sensitive microphones picked up an unnatural layering to the sound. The moans shifted in pitch, some breaking into high human-like tones that mimicked whispers or even calls for help. Mason, filming through the fog with a long lens camera, thought he glimpsed movement, a silhouette, unnaturally tall and thin, weaving between the trees. Every time he tried to focus, the figure would blur or vanish entirely. The team reported an immediate feeling of being watched. Even with flashlights cutting swaths through the fog, the shadows seemed to twist in unnatural ways, stretching longer than physics should allow. By midnight, the howls intensified. They seemed to move around the camp, shifting from one ridge to another, rising and falling as if conversing with each other. Claire swore she heard the calls forming words, Fragmented, distorted pleas and laughter intermingled in a language that was neither fully human nor entirely animal. Dylan's equipment recorded the sounds at varying frequencies, some inaudible to the human ear, yet registered on the monitors. Mason described the air pressure changing, thickening as though invisible hands pressed on their chests. Then the first visual encounter occurred. Two glowing amber eyes appeared through the fog, fixed on the camp. The figure was impossibly tall, its limbs elongated, moving with a fluid, predatory grace. When Mason raised his camera, the eyes vanished, but the howling rose to a terrifying crescendo, surrounding the team from every direction. Hours passed in near panic. Every time they tried to leave the clearing, the fog seemed to rearrange itself, twisting the familiar terrain into unfamiliar paths. The howls followed, echoing and layering, creating the sensation that dozens of creatures circled them invisibly. At one point, Claire stumbled on a root, catching herself only to see a silhouette standing silently a few feet away. It had no discernible facial features, only the glowing eyes and elongated limbs that seemed to scrape the ground as it moved. When she whispered to the others, the figure vanished. Dylan later reviewed audio recordings and noticed that the timing of the howls perfectly synchronized with their movements, as if something unseen was tracking their steps, anticipating them. As dawn approached, the team reached the edge of the valley. Exhausted, shivering, and disoriented, they found the creek where they had set camp. Everything appeared untouched. The fire pit still smoldered, equipment intact. But Mason's camera footage revealed the true horror. Multiple shadowy forms with glowing amber eyes standing behind trees, in the water, and even above the tree line. One figure extended a long skeletal arm, pointing toward the camera before dissolving into the fog. On the playback, the howls could be heard, now distorted, rising and falling in rhythm as if mocking the survivors. Even after leaving Black Hollow, the team reported lasting effects. Claire experienced frequent auditory hallucinations, whispers and howls in the dead of night. Dylan claimed that electronic devices would sometimes emit distorted static in his apartment, echoing the layered calls recorded in the hollow. Mason refused to photograph dense fog for months, citing an instinctive fear that the eyes were still watching, waiting for him to return. Locals now warn anyone traveling near the valley, the hollow doesn't just echo the past. It collects it, layering the voices of those lost and twisting them into warnings, lures, or perhaps hunts. To this day, hikers report hearing low, guttural howls that mimic human cries when passing near the hollow after dark. Some claim they see fleeting silhouettes moving between the trees, while others feel a presence pressing on their chest or shoulders, urging them to keep moving or risk vanishing. The valley is said to shift at night, paths elongating, clearing turning into forest, and the fog weaving into corridors that lead travelers deeper into the darkness. The howling of Black Hollow persists, a chilling reminder that in Appalachia, some places remember and some places wait. And when you hear those amber-eyed howls, it's never just the wind calling your name. It's something alive, hungry, and patient, waiting for the next wanderer to step into its grasp.